So I was on a call earlier this morning with a client of ours, and talking about purpose, talking about why, what, why we do what we do. And both of us have a sense of contribute as our why. We like to give back. We want to serve in different capacities. But we kind of got personal at the end. He was asking me about my time in ministry, what got me into ministry in the first place. And it never crossed my mind until I was having that conversation with him that the reason that got me in was also the same reason that got me out. And I'm like, wow, it's like a bookend experience for me that there, and I know many people find themselves in a very similar position where you don't necessarily like what you're doing. Many would say they hate what they're doing. They believe that there's got to be something more for them. They feel disconnected, often with themselves, with their heart, in what I would say, myself included, and how that's what got me into that life of service. But it was also the catapult of what got me out, where I was really hating what I was doing. I loved the theological side. I did not like the church side. It just wasn't, it felt very constraining, very small for me. And so it was that same thing. Like I got to believe there's something more. There's got to be something more for me. Like this can't be it. And I remember now looking back, like for years I would say that, like there's just got to be something more. And in my experience, like that's a lot of people. If you're listening to this, you probably have been in that moment because we live our lives unaligned. We're out of touch, especially when we're in our 20s. What 20-year-old knows themselves well enough to be able to make a lifelong commitment decision? I haven't met many. And I'm a perfect example. I mean, I entered seminary at 25. I was not ordained until I was in my 30s, but still didn't quite know myself well enough to say, maybe this isn't the actual path. Now, I didn't have the language that I would use today working with clients, working with people in coaching, with values and alignment and your purpose and your why. That language just was not used. It was built in, I think, in some ways. Like, all right, well, if you're doing this, more than likely you want to serve God in some ways. And yet it still wasn't enough. There still wasn't the fulfillment that I was looking for in my life. And it took me 15 years to finally say, I can't do it anymore. And I I think everyone has their own moment. Everyone has whatever that is for them as to what eventually gets them out. Or for that matter, just like, I'm going to buckle down and I'm going to do this for the next 20 years. I don't care if I'm resentful. I don't care if I regret anything. I'm just going to do it because I need the paycheck. And so often that paycheck plays into it, myself included, even though I wasn't paid great money in ministry. But there comes that moment where it's like, is this it? Is this really it? This is all my life is going to be? And I remember being there, and I remember being in those moments and talking to this client this morning who's had similar experiences in his own life. But it's a scary place to be, and yet an exciting place to be, because it's like, all right, there's got to be something else out there for me. And yet very scary when your entire identity has been wrapped up in the life you had been living. For mine, priest 15, ministry total like 22 years, was a good chunk of my life. At that moment when I left, that was about half of my life. And so to just kind of step away from that is not easy. And he asked me, well, what eventually did it to you? And if you know my story, you know it was my health. I was declining. I had a hard time even breathing, walking into a church. I felt like it was suffocating me. And I've met people in corporate jobs and other jobs who have had similar experiences. And the easy answer is go get a therapist, get yourself drugged up, do whatever you need to do in order to keep going. And I've told this story many times now, but even in my process of leaving, it was never at that moment about just leaving it all behind. It wasn't until I started to get healthier where I began to realize, oh, like I feel much better not in that life. And why would I go back to something that was literally making me feel like I was suffocating? And a friend asked me yesterday, like, was there a moment where you finally said, "That's it, I can't go back"? And I remember being up in Maine. Maine's been one of my favorite places to go. It's a little bit of heaven for me. I literally remember standing on the shoreline, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean on the rocky space where last time I was there you couldn't even go in that space anymore. It was blocked off. But I remember standing there, and in that moment, after a couple days of retreat there, recognizing I don't have that angst anymore. Like that angst within myself of it's got to be more, got to be more, got to be more was gone. And it wasn't until that moment where I realized, oh, like that was such the normal part of who I was that I didn't even recognize that it had been gone, or how I had changed in the midst of that and transitioned out. And so what you do with that question, or if that question is surfacing, it's such an important thing to not just wipe away and say, I just don't feel it. Nah, really. I mean, you'll make every excuse, you'll rationalize your decision to stay where you are. And I get that. I did that for many years as well. It's what I know. This is the commitment I made, and a lot of that stuff begins to come into play. It's an obligation. But if that question is surfacing, like there's got to be something more. There's got to be something more. You're starting to feel the regrets. I remember the regrets just kind of like flooding me in that moment. Um, it's a good time to pause, and the natural reaction is like go 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 go, because I don't want to face it. I don't want to confront the question that is coming up within me. And yet it's such an important question that you could not have answered in your 20s. I'm convinced you just could not have answered that question in your 20s. It probably begins to surface in your 30s, and for many of us in our 40s, it just kind of smacks us in the face. And so if it's starting to come up, I like don't know if I like where I'm at, or I'm starting to feel that angstiness, I'm looking for something more. Don't just let it sit. Don't just let it be there and ignore it and pretend it's not there, or it'll go away. It's not going to go away until you address what's going on inside yourself. And I like that is scary. You're talking to a guy who did a lot of work on himself, and at the same time convinced himself to keep going back into it. Why would you do that? It's like I get out of prison, so I'm going to put myself back in there because that's all I know. But that's how it felt over and over again. And I thought I had to stay. I thought I had to settle. And I don't think there's a worse feeling for any of us as human beings than thinking we need to settle in our lives. Like, this is it. This is the best it gets. I don't think we were created for that. I don't think we were put on this earth to settle for something less and just kind of do it over and over and over and over again. I do believe we're conditioned that way. It's a part of growing up. But if we really want to grow up and we really want to embrace um, later stages in life, I guess for lack of better terms, midlife, as I've often talked about on these videos, that we got to be willing to confront that question. And it's a sad state when someone just kind of gives into that question. I was listening to an interview today of a guy who had contemplated suicide when that question was surfacing, because it's so easy to convince ourselves that I have failed, that why did I do this in the first place? And I know for myself, I had to recontextualize it and say, this is what has gotten me here. And I don't have to be ashamed of that. I don't have to be angry at that. I don't like, it's where I was in that moment. I made the best choice I could in that moment. and then you go with it and you build on it. And if it means stepping away, then step away and really confront that question. I just think it's such a vital question, to be able to say, what do you want more of? What is it that you want more of? And what are you going to do to change directions if that's what it takes in order to get what you want more of? But it's an internal question. No one can answer that question for you. It's a question that you're going to have to face yourself.